All right, today I want to start with a little crowd participation, and I need you guys to be honest, which normally isn't a problem. So this probably won't be here either. I need you to be honest. I'm just curious. Raise your hand if you ever ran away from home as a kid. Go ahead. Let me see. Yeah, okay, great. I knew there'd be rebels in the room. That's awesome. So you don't have to raise your hand on this, but I want you to think about this. If you ran away from home as a kid, or you know somebody who did, how fast did they come back home? Less than 24 hours in all probability, right? And the reason for that is because we all make the classic mistake when we run away from home. We're so focused on what we're running from. Oh, I'm so mad at mom or dad, or, whoever. We're so focused on what we're running from that we don't spend any time thinking about what we're running to. And you knew if you ran away, you knew once you got there, you're like, oh, I did not prepare appropriately, My wife did this. She ran away from home, and I was asking her about this story, and she said, I don't know why, but we took a clothes basket and some sheets. And I was like, yeah, that wasn't going to get done in the woods. So you just didn't prepare enough. We're also focused on what we're running from. We forget to think about what we're running to. Now, I want to ask you another question. It's a far more personal question, so don't raise your hand on this one. But I want you to think about this. Have you ever run away from God? And the answer to that is yes, for most all of us. Because when I talk about running away from God, here's all I mean. There's been some point in our lives where we intentionally chose not to do something we thought God wanted us to do, or we intentionally chose to do something we were certain God didn't want us to do. And we didn't care. We were just going to do it anyway. And if you've ever made those choices over and over and over again, well, you've run from God. I don't know what it was for you. It may have been a relationship that you were in and you knew it wasn't healthy for you, but you just stayed in it because you were stubborn. You didn't want to get out. Or it may have been the opposite. You shouldn't have gotten out of a relationship, but they just made you uncomfortable because their faith was strong and they talked about, I don't know what it was, but it was like, I should stay in this, but I'm getting out. I'm running. So you just got out. Or maybe it was a behavior that you knew you needed to change. You just didn't want to change it. A habit you just didn't want to break. And so you're like, it doesn't matter. I'm going to do what I want to do. And you just ran. Or it could be something on the flip side where you felt a sense of calling, if you will. You felt like there is something I'm supposed to do here. And you just so didn't want to do it that you were willing to be stubborn, rebellious, do anything you had to do to avoid that and not do it. I don't know what it looks like, but I bet most of us in this room, myself included, have done this at some point. And if you're thinking, well, no, Matt, I never got really wild. I'm not talking about that. You don't have to be wild to be a runner, okay? So there are two different types of runners. There are defiant runners, and defiant runners are the ones you think about. Like if you're a defiant runner, you don't care if your rebellion's public. You don't care who sees it. Like it doesn't matter to you. You're like, oh, yeah, I'm sticking it to them. It's like I'll just do whatever I want to do. And I don't care who knows. But a lot of us are what I would call quiet runners. And quiet runners, it's a little different. With quiet runners, we still care about our image, and we still care about people thinking we're doing the right thing. So quiet runners are often the ones who still show up at church, kind of go through the motions, kind of do the deal. But we know secretly there's like a tension, a battle raging inside of us because there's some things we're just running away from that we're not going to do that we know we should do, or vice versa. So for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be in a series we're calling White Flag. And in this series, we are going to study 3 what I think you're going to find are surprising lessons from one of history's most famous runners. And the third lesson, the one we're going to talk about in week 3, is probably the most shocking of all of them. But the reason we're going to talk about this is I think there's a little bit of his story in all of us. Now, I don't care if you're a church person or not, even if it's your first time in church, the odds are probably good that you have heard of the guy we're going to look at for the next 3 weeks. And the reason I say that is because at least if you grew up in the South, when summer came, your mama got so tired of you being at home that she sent you off to VBS so she could have free childcare. Anybody go to vacation Bible schools? All right. If you ever went to a vacation Bible school, you heard this story because it's like they just talk about it every year. They thought it was a cool story. We're going to talk about the story of a man named Jonah, okay? Now, when you hear Jonah, if you know anything about this story at all, when you hear Jonah, you think this right here. That's immediately what you think about, right? And some of you, I get it. Some of you are going, okay, Matt, I'm out right now. Because if you expect me to spend 3 weeks listening to you talk about some tale of a guy who lived in the belly of a fish for 3 days and then came out alive, I'm not that crazy. I'm not buying that. And I totally get it. So if you have a hard time believing this part of the story, I want to give you an out, okay? So lean in here. I want to give you an out. Here's what I want you to think about. You read fiction stories and you watch fictional movies all the time and you get inspired by them. Sometimes you learn lessons from them that you apply to your life. And that doesn't seem to bother you at all. So if you have a hard time believing the fish part of Jonah's story, which is just a little part of it, okay? But if you have a hard time believing it, I don't want you to throw the whole story out and ignore these lessons. So I just want you to think of it like you would your favorite fictional novel or your favorite fictional movie, okay? You can still learn lessons from this story. Now, before I get any emails, let me just make it clear. I actually believe all of the story, including the fish part, okay? And the reason I believe it, I'm not a very smart guy. The reason I believe it's pretty simple. My theory is if a man can predict his own death and resurrection and pull it off, I'll believe whatever he says. And Jesus, when he was here, said this happened. So I'm just going with him. But even if you don't believe it, perfectly fine. You can still learn from this. But I want to focus on this story for the next little bit because I'm telling you, there's a lot of Jonah in all of us. So I'm going to give you a little context. We'll jump into the story. Jonah was a Jewish prophet who lived in the 8th century BC. So that's, 800 years before Jesus walked the earth. Now, here was the job of a prophet. Be glad you're not one. It wasn't a fun one. The job of a prophet is they would get a message from God that they were supposed to go and deliver to a group of people who were running from God. So you can imagine, they were never very popular. If you have to go tell a group of people who don't want to pay attention to God that God's got something to tell them, and it was usually not good news, then you were not going to be received very well. And so that's what prophets did. And that's what you would assume Jonah was going to do. But there is a big twist in Jonah's story. So here's how the writer of Jonah's story, his running from God, here's how he begins it. He says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, go to the great city of Nineveh. Pause real quick. In history class in high school or in college, whatever, you have heard of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire was the most powerful empire in the world at this time, and Nineveh was the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. So this is where he's telling Jonah to go. I want you to go to the great city of Nineveh. I want you to preach against it because its wickedness has come up before me. Now, you are more familiar with where Nineveh was located than you realize. I'm going to give you a little geographical context, okay? So Nineveh was the ancient location of the present-day city in Iraq by the name of Mosul. So they're going to put a map up here in just a second for you. You can see here's Baghdad, okay? Everybody's heard of Baghdad. 250 miles up the Tigris River, you find Mosul today, and that's where Nineveh was located back in the 8th century. There were about 120,000 people who lived in this city at the time. The Assyrians, as I said, they were the most powerful empire in the world. They were known for being incredible warriors, but they were most famous for having perfected a certain type of torture. Now, don't think about this too long. It'll make your stomach turn, but I'm going to tell you what it was. The Assyrians had perfected the art of skinning their enemies alive and then prolonging their death as long as possible. So imagine that. The Assyrians were the kind of people that thought, you know what we should get really good at? Let's skin people and keep them alive to suffer as long as we can. These were not people you hung out with on the weekend, okay? And oh, by the way, the Assyrians considered Jonah's people, the Jewish people, to be some of their enemies. So now imagine that you're Jonah and God comes to you and says, I got a message. I want you to go tell the Assyrians up in their capital city that if they don't change their ways, I'm going to bring some judgment on them. If you're Jonah, what are you going to do? Are you going to go, well, that sounds awesome. I've always wanted to get skinned. It's like, no. You're going to do probably exactly what Jonah did. The writer of the story goes on, and he tells us this. He said, Jonah ran away from the Lord. He headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship that was bound for that port. And after paying the fare, he went aboard and he sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Now, When Jonah ran, he really ran. I want to show you one more map, okay? And then we'll be done with maps. So I want to show you one more. So they're going to throw this map up here, and it's going to show you Jonah grew up in a little town. He lived in a little town called Gath-Hepher in Israel. It's right there. Here's where Nineveh is, about 500 miles northeast. That is the direction Jonah should have gone. But instead, Jonah was like, there ain't no way I'm going to them. So he went down here to this port city of Joppa, not too far away. He found a ship that was going on a trade route. He paid the fare. He jumped on this ship that was going not to Greece, not a little further away or going to Italy or what. No. He found a ship that was going 2,300 miles to Spain, to Tarshish. This is where it was. This was Jonah's way of saying, God, I ain't going to do what you're asking me to do, and there's no way you can make me do it. Watch this. He gets on this ship. He's like, when I get to Tarshish, there's no way God will ever get me to Nineveh. I'm so far away, I can never get back there. So he's on this ship. They take off sailing. Nobody on the ship knows why he's on it. They just think he needs to get to Spain. These guys run this trade route all the time. They've done it hundreds of times probably. But along the way, as Jonah thinks he's safe, God will never find me now. Well, here's what the writer says happens next. He says, then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up, and all the sailors were afraid. Each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. Now, you got to remember, these are not weekend recreational boaters. These guys live on the Mediterranean Sea. All they do is run this trade route. These are hardened, experienced sailors. So that tells you this storm was not like storms they were used to seeing. This storm was so bad, it made sailors pray. That's how bad the storm was, okay? They were up on deck going, we're not going to make it on our own. We got to ask for some help. Do you know any gods? Well, I heard one. So they're just grabbing any gods. Anybody heard Poseidon? I think he's over. It's like, we're going to pray to any god we've ever heard of and see if anything happens. And they did. Meanwhile, it's kind of funny when you read it. Meanwhile, Jonah is not in the least bit interested in joining the prayer meeting. The writer tells us this, but Jonah had gone below deck where he lay down and he fell into a deep sleep right in the middle of this storm. So the captain went to him and said, how can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he'll take notice of us and we will not perish. The captain's basically like, we tried to pray, but we're not exactly religious anyway. So we tried to pray and we couldn't get any God to help us. So we don't know who your God is, but we'd like for you to come try your prayers to your God and let's see if it'll work. To which I'm kind of reading between the lines, but I think Jonah looked back at him and said, well, if it's all the same to you, I'd just soon go back to sleep because I'm trying for God not to notice me. It's the whole reason I'm on this ship. I don't want to tell him where I am. I don't think he wants to hear from me right now. So they're sitting there going, well, what are we going to do? And so the sailors did something that was custom to do back in those days whenever you got desperate. Story says this. Then the sailors said to each other, come, let us cast lots to find out who's responsible for this calamity. I do not recommend you try this method, okay? Here's basically what it was. Back then when they would get desperate enough and they couldn't get answers, they would say, everybody draw straws. Whoever gets the shortest straw, you're guilty. That's how it worked. So they do this. The writer tells us that the sailors cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. God was like, I'm going to make sure he has the short straw. I want them all to know it's his fault. So the lot fell on Jonah. And so these sailors now are like, okay, we didn't know who you were, why you were on the ship, but you're the problem now. So they start interrogating him. The writer tells us, so they looked at Jonah. They asked him, tell us, who's responsible for making all this trouble for us? And they start quizzing him with all these questions. What do you do? Where do you come from? What's your country? From what people are you? And so Jonah answers them. He says, well, I'm a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made, well, this is kind of embarrassing to admit, who made the sea that's about to kill us all, and the land. Now, this is a part of the story where the sailors are like, okay, well, Jonah, if you're responsible, what do you need to do to get this to stop? Because we're all about to die. And you would think at that point that Jonah would say, my bad, guys. I'm real sorry. Didn't mean to rope you into this. Listen, find the next port, let me off, I'll go to Nineveh, the storm will disappear, everything will be good. That's what a rational person would do. But instead, Jonah looks back at them and he says, well, I'll tell you what you need to do. You just pick me up and throw me into the sea, and it'll become calm. I know it's my fault this great storm has come upon you. Wait a minute, you're not willing just to do what God said? No, I'd rather die. Just throw me in the Mediterranean and let me drown. I'm not going to Nineveh. Now, this seems ridiculous, but we have all been this stubborn before. It seems ridiculous, but all of us have had moments where the consequences of our choices have caught up to us, and as painful as it is, we still haven't had enough humility to say, okay, I'm ready to change. Where instead we have looked God right in the eye and said, you know what? You can kill me. I don't care if these consequences crush me. I am not doing what you asked me to do. That is where Jonah is. And so these sailors, you got to just imagine this. They're up on this ship. Again, storm's still raging. They don't think they've got much time left. And they're kind of huddled up like, what do? We don't want to kill him, but, well, he did ask for it. You know, and we don't want to die. He said throw him over. So the writer tells us that finally they decided they have no other option. So they took Jonah, they threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. Now, I just want you to use your imagination for a minute, because I think this may have been a pretty funny moment. Imagine that you think everything's about to go down with the ship, and you toss this guy into a raging Mediterranean Sea, certain he's going to drown. But the minute he hits the water, the storm just ends. Now you've got Jonah treading water, and all the sailors looking back going, well, should we go back and get him? It's not worth the risk. Just leave, It's like, they didn't want to do it. They didn't feel like they had an option. Meanwhile, Jonah is bobbing in the water going, see, God, I told you, I am not going to Nineveh. And then the writer says that the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. Now listen, you got to know at that point, because you know how the story ends, but Jonah didn't know how the story ended. You got to know at that point Jonah was thinking, I was willing to drown to keep from doing what you said, God. But to send a fish to kill me is a little overkill. It's like, how cruel can you be, Because he doesn't know what's going to happen. But the writer tells us Jonah was inside that fish 3 days and 3 nights. And from inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. Well, I'm sure he did. Because if you had to live 3 days inside of a fish, you'd get to a breaking point too and be like, okay, I surrender. Now, next week, we're going to look at the prayer that Jonah prayed. And you don't want to miss next week, because we've all had our moments of desperation. And we've all had our moments when we broke and said, okay, God. But you've never had rock bottom where you were inside of a fish for 3 days. That's a different kind of prayer. And you're going to see next week how different a prayer it was. But Jonah is going to teach us something really valuable through his prayer that he learned at some point over those 3 days and 3 nights in that fish. And he's going to show all of us who maybe are right in the middle of running from God in some area of our life, he's going to show us how to pray and come back, because that's what he ends up doing. But that's not the lesson for today. The thing I hope you walk away from today is simply this, that you may give up on God, but God never gives up on you. You may give up on God. You may be so rebellious. You may be so stubborn. You may be so harsh. You may be so done with him that you say, I'm done. I'm just never going to follow him. You may give up on God. But you will learn, just like Jonah learned. It doesn't matter how far you run. God never gives up on you. Which, I'll be honest, if you're in the middle of running from God right now, that actually doesn't feel like good news, does it? This is what's annoying you. It's why you're kind of frustrated right now, because you're like, good grief. They invited me to come to church, and I finally gave in, and of all the days for him to be talking about this, it's today. And God's been sending people into your life who've been telling you, you should probably change. You should think about that. That's not going to end well for you. You just get so frustrated because you can't escape it all. And you just want to be left alone. You just want to do like Jonah did and get as far away as you possibly can. But the truth is, even though you give up on God, he does not give up on you, just like any great loving father would if he saw his child running into trouble. God runs after you. God doesn't run after you to pay you back. He runs after you to win you back. And I'm confident of that because you know what happened about 750 years after Jonah ran? God showed up on earth in the form of Jesus. And he lived a perfect life to replace all of our running and imperfection. And then he died and rose again to pay the penalty for all of our sin and rebellion. So God's not running after you to pay you back because there's nothing left to be paid. Jesus paid it all for you. He's running after you because he wants you to experience forgiveness. And he wants you to avoid more pain. And he wants you to embrace being a part of his family. And he wants you to become who he created you to be and to live the life he created you to live. That's why he's running after you. And the beauty of it is, if you ever decide to turn around and stop running, you don't have to go looking for him. If you ever stop and turn around, you're going to find he's right there. He's been there all along. Just waiting for you to be ready to change. So, I'm going to give you a heads up. Next week, we're going to look at Jonah's prayer. And for all of us who are running in some way from God, I'm going to give you an opportunity next week to pray the kind of prayer Jonah prayed, where you stop running. You're welcome. I just gave you a 7-day notice. Y'all can get all your rebellion out this week, okay? Whatever's still on your list. No, I'm kidding. Probably don't want to do that. But I would say, if you're sitting here and you're like, I have been running and I knew better. I have been running and man, I was so focused on what I was running from, I never paid any attention to what I was running to, and now I've ended up somewhere I don't want to be, with a life I don't want to have, with relationships in a place I don't want them to be. I'm just telling you, you can wave the white flag and turn around and surrender today. And it is not complicated. You don't have to prove to God that you've changed. You don't have to work and earn it. You don't have to try to show him, I'm going to be different. He's waiting on you like any loving father would. All you have to do is turn around and say, I'm ready to come home. I want you to forgive me. And I want to try to follow you as best I can. I want to be a part of your family, and I want to live like I'm a part of your family. That's all you have to do. Because it doesn't matter how far you've run or what you've done. You may give up on God. But I'm just telling you, he never, ever, ever gives up on you. And if you'll just stop running and turn around, you'll find he's right there with arms open wide, waiting to welcome you back home. Let me pray for us. Father, for all of us who are runners, it doesn't matter if we're defiant or quiet. For all of us who are runners, it's hard sometimes for us to let go of our stubbornness, of our rebellion, our arrogance. It's hard to be humble enough to admit that we need to change. But would you help us to have enough courage to admit that, enough humility to be willing to stop running? And we just want to pause and say how grateful we are that we don't have to make up everything we've messed up with you. That you're just waiting to welcome us with your grace, your love, your forgiveness, your unconditional acceptance. So I pray you would just give us enough courage to do that today. And allow you to begin to rebuild the things that we've broken, to clean up the messes that we've made. It's in your name we pray. Amen.